Hey there and welcome back to another DreamWorks video. And today I want to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane and talk about the Shrek franchise, its past, its present, and especially its future. Where it goes from here. How does it adapt to the times and revitalize the world and characters it introduced way back in 2001? Do they go full reboot, soft reboot, or just continue on from the story being told? And I honestly don't know. Because in truth, they do have pretty big shoes to fill. When Shrek released way back in 2001, it was really unlike anything that was made at that time. It really did popularize the absurd toilet humor and parody in animated films of the 2000s and made a big splash in the industry. Whilst these types of films and TV shows had been made before, they'd never been met with such overwhelming success, and studios took note and started to use this new formula to try and replicate the success. And suddenly, DreamWorks was the top dog, even if it was only for a brief period of time. It grossed $487 million off of $60 million, and it did well with critics and audiences alike. And most notably, it well and truly wormed its way into pop culture and became one of the most important animated works in history, being the first non-Disney animated film to be preserved in the National Film Registry of the United States. But accolades and legacy aside for a moment, it's just a really fun and enjoyable film. The characters have depth. Shrek, Donkey, Fiona. They're all fully realised characters with fleshed out personalities and character arcs. They aren't just vessels for the narrative with little development beyond that. The jokes are fun and fresh, and despite the abundance of toilet humour, the film's also quite witty. It has layers. It was fun, unique, with silly dance montages and random songs that came out of nowhere, mixed with unique takes on classic fairy tales and unexpected plot twists that were both dramatic and, at times, hilarious. The character interactions were fun, the banter was fierce, the animation was good for its time, the music was great, infusing actual songs into the soundtrack instead of simply having a completely original score. It fired on all cylinders and spawned an entire franchise. Sequels, spin-offs, specials, more books, video games, a Broadway musical, you name it, they made it. Which leads us to Shrek 2, which well and truly solidified the franchise into pop culture forever and did everything that Shrek 1 did, and did it just as well as the original. Only this time, it was way more financially lucrative, grossing $928 million off an increased budget of $150 million, getting fairly similar critical scores, and well and truly cementing the legacy of the entire franchise. DreamWorks could have churned out a feature-length film of Shrek sitting on the toilet in the swamp to get out of very stubborn shit, and people would have still bought tickets after these first two films. And honestly, considering the quality of Shrek the Third, maybe that would have been preferable. And so, then we come to Shrek the Third. A terrible film, all things considered. Quite unexpectedly bad. In my experience, usually these things start as a bit of a slower decline. The first film or two are great, and then the scores slowly but surely start to get lower and lower, and after a while, the audience catches on to what's happening, and the box office begins to dry up as the franchise slowly begins to die. Shrek the Third was not this. Shrek the Third was like walking through a beautiful meadow of flowers and then suddenly falling off a cliff to your death onto some very sharp rocks. There was really nothing leading into this that hinted that it would be bad. There was nothing going into the film that you could have looked at to say, see, DreamWorks is losing their touch. The decline of Shrek has begun. Yeah, the trailer was kind of heavy on the toilet humor and all that, but like, every single Shrek trailer in history has relied on this sort of thing. It gets the kids to watch. But in the end, the proof wasn't in the pudding. Shrek the Third just wasn't it. It didn't have the same charm as the first two films, and it was honestly the Cars 2 of its time, taking a fun concept and using it up for all it's worth, overexposing it to the point that it was no longer funny and deeply cringe. Hell, I mean, even as a kid, I kind of found this film deeply forgettable. A few cheap laughs here and there, but no substance whatsoever. And then we came to Shrek Forever After, which, well, obviously it wasn't a complete return to form for the franchise, and it didn't really hit those same highs that the series is known for, but it was at least a bit better than Shrek the Third, and deserves celebrating for that at the very least. It wasn't a complete disaster, even though it was a time travel, alternate universe wish type deal, and those always have the potential to be truly, truly bad. And whilst the end result isn't great, it was better than nothing and at least washed the terrible taste of Shrek the Third out of our collective mouths. And on top of that, it did well at the box office, so. But after that, that was it for Shrek. Finished, gone, done, no more. Yeah, there were still specials released after this, and then the Puss in Boots prequel movie that did fairly well for itself, and that's now spawned its own sequel that does look like it could be fairly good, but there was no real new Shrek content, and I think that was for the best. The world needed to cool off on Shrek. The franchise had been beginning its obvious decline, and DreamWorks wanted to get out whilst the franchise was still in the green and not bleeding money as fans abandoned ship. They needed time to forget how the quality had dipped, to forget how the story got worse and worse, and how the laughs eventually ran dry. And so this is when the rumblings of a potential fifth Shrek film began to take shape. There'd always been discussion of this, of course, and the franchise had been planned to have a fifth film as early as 2004. And this plan held true until the development of the fourth film, when it was decided that Shrek Forever After would be the final chapter for our big green machine. And thus, Shrek 5 was scrapped. But after a number of years, more and more rumours and interviews pointed to the idea that maybe DreamWorks weren't quite finished after all, that they weren't ready to completely let go of this cash cow, with reports as late as 2018 pointing to the imminent announcement of a fifth film. But it never came. They kind of winked at the camera and said, "Oh yeah, we'll be making one at some point, writing the script as we speak." But it hasn't eventuated by this stage of the game, and I don't know why it hasn't cropped up, but honestly, I think it is a good thing. I think the longer they wait, the more people are going to forget about the franchise's shortcomings and focus on how much they miss Shrek, on how much they'd be excited for a fifth film, and how hyped they are to potentially hear all those old voices again after all these years. So, with that being said, perhaps after the release of Puss in Boots 2, we're going to get some sort of announcement one way or another. I guess it probably depends on whether this film does well or not. But that being said, from what we know of the draft scripts and concepts, at least according to insider sources, so take that with a big old grain of salt, suggests that this is a big change of pace for Shrek, a new direction. And so realistically, I think there are three main ways to make this a reality. The first is to just continue on with the franchise. Honestly, probably in the form of a time skip where the focus is more heavily placed on Shrek's kids, while still keeping him as the focal point. And honestly, I think this does have potential as something that DreamWorks might follow through on. A reboot of any kind could be alienating to the audience. After all, whether you like them or not, there's a shit ton of nostalgia wrapped up in these films. It seems like it would be needlessly antagonizing to the wider audience at large to potentially replace their childhood classics so soon after they were made the first time. It's only been 20 years. This is the safe bet option. After all, aside from using new characters, Shrek rarely references the events of previous films anyway, so it's not like you need to worry that the less good movies are going to be followed up on. But I think that the main problem with this is that it feels needless. I feel like the original run of Shrek films ended through creative stagnation. There wasn't really a direction to take this story anymore, and so they stopped. That doesn't really stop being true just because time's passed or because there's new writers and whatnot. The story is still there. It's been made, and it's at a dead end. It would be very hard to continue with, in my opinion. I mean, remember how they tried to continue Return of the Jedi with the sequel trilogy despite 6 being the perfect ending to the Skywalker saga? Did that end well? No. And they had over 30 years to think that up. Stories should be made where there's room for them. But when they reach their organic end, you end them. Or you reboot. And the reboot idea is honestly the one that I think they're the most likely to follow through with. The question simply remains as to whether they go for a hard reboot or a soft reboot. And for those that are unaware of what this means, a hard reboot would be them wiping the board clean. A fresh start. None of the events of the previous Shreks 1 to 4 ever happened for these versions of the characters. And thus, they're free to take the story in whatever direction they choose. They're no longer beholden to the previous writing choices, whether they be good or bad. And I think this opens up a whole lot of story potential for the franchise, but once again, that audience perception comes into play. People would be pissed. There are no two ways about it. Shrek 1 and 2 are beloved films. And if you try to replace them, which is how a lot of people perceive remakes, and I mean, whether you agree or disagree with that statement, the reality remains that a lot of people do think like that. And thus, there's that element of trying to usurp their nostalgia. And that's just a breeding ground for toxicity and hate. It doesn't seem like a worthwhile endeavor to stir up that particular hornet's nest. Ever. So really, that just leaves us with option 3. The soft reboot. And honestly, this is the one I would choose if I was in charge. You take the elements of the series that you liked and that the people liked, and the things that worked well, and you quietly shuffle off the characters and story points that didn't work and that people didn't like. You put them off to the side and you kind of forget they exist. And so, whilst you're still somewhat beholden to the past, there's more room to move. And I think you can avoid the heaviest criticism making a remake by continuing on with elements of the originals, even if they're not really referenced all that heavily. To me, it just simply seems like the best of both worlds. But regardless of what direction they go, I think I'll be pretty happy. As long as it's not a prequel. I think a Shrek prequel would just be the worst. And I don't know why, it's just the vibe of the thing.
It's the vibe, and no, that's it. It's the vibe.
But anyway, that's the end of the video. And I would like to say that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of a potential return to the Shrek-verse? Think it would be good? Do you hope it stays in developmental hell forever? How would you want to see it done? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.